So I've been very clear about my opinion of what I've seen of James Gunn's Superman so far up until this point. But one thing that I haven't done yet is say definitively whether or not this movie will flop or succeed. And that's mostly to do with the fact that it's going to depend on the word of mouth around the movie and the reaction of the general public. In the end, all the fanboy bickering isn't going to mean jack shit as it pertains to the success or failure of this movie. It's going to depend on the general public, period, point blank, and we don't really have a way at this point to gauge the general public's interest. Which is why I find some of these early predictions for Superman's box office a little bit hard to believe. Let's discuss.
I watch so you don't have to.
All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
So just a few days ago, we got our first look at the early tracking numbers for James Gunn's Superman. The film is reportedly set to earn $154 to $175 million on its domestic box office opening weekend. This would potentially be the highest opening weekend of 2025, and it would be the biggest opening ever for a Superman film.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
Now, I'm not entirely clear of where some of these accounts and publications get these numbers from, but I always feel like, especially recently, that these numbers are always more exaggerated than they are conservative predictions. Let us not forget that The Flash had early tracking numbers of 115 to 140 million domestic opening weekend, and that abomination of a movie only ended up making 55 million in its opening weekend. So needless to say, we need to take early tracking numbers with a massive grain of salt. Also, let us not forget that other unsuccessful comic book movies have opened to impressive first week numbers recently, only to fall off a cliff in the second week. With superhero fatigue running rampant right now, it only becomes more clear every time one of these movies comes out that the diehards still show up week 1, but there is rarely much carryover into week 2. In fact, second week drop-offs have basically become the norm in the comic book movie genre at this point. So much so that I don't put a ton of stock into any first week numbers at all anymore. The question will be, can Superman hold? Will Superman have legs beyond its opening weekend? Because it will need to turn a profit. That's not a guarantee in the crowded summer movie season that is fastly approaching. And to be clear, I'm not just picking on Superman here, because I feel the same exact way about Fantastic Four over at Marvel. These are all things that people have to take into consideration when talking about the box office for any big budget movie, not just Superman. There are certain trends at play here, trends in the comic book movie genre that can no longer be ignored. I do happen to think that this is the worst possible time to be trying to reboot a DC cinematic universe.
It's true.
Because again, comic book movie trends tell us that unless your film is propped up by nostalgia, like Deadpool and Wolverine or No Way Home, it is unlikely to do earth-shattering numbers. And James Gunn's Superman does not have the benefit of a built-in nostalgia gimmick to help it. More importantly than all of this, we needed to hear actual numbers to figure out exactly where this movie stands. We needed to know the budget, and when I say the budget, I mean the whole budget, not just the one that they want to report. And again, I don't say this as a way of picking on WB, DC, and Superman specifically, because I've talked about this same exact thing with a lot of recent Marvel projects as well. How many times did the media try to convince us over the past several months that movies like Brave New World and Thunderbolts only had a $180 million budget? And they tried to implant this idea that as long as the movies cross that number, that they would be profitable.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
But we know the truth, don't we? Because we know that these reports are conveniently not factoring in things like marketing budgets, or the percentage that movie theaters take from a movie's earnings. So when we hear that a movie like Superman has a $225 million budget, while that is a lot more believable than what Marvel was trying to sell us, we still have to ask ourselves, is that the real budget or just the budget that WB once reported? And yes, they are two very different things. I strongly believe that this has become a new tactic among studios when these movies started to be not as profitable as they once were. According to one insider, crossing 500 million worldwide is considered the break-even point for Superman. According to a top talent agent, the film needs to cross 700 million worldwide to be considered a success. Now, in a perfect situation, the 500 to 700 million dollar window does seem attainable. But I have to be honest, when I heard these numbers, when I heard how they were being presented, something just didn't feel right to me. So what I did is I added who I like to call the box office guru, the YouTube channel Wolfman's Got Nards, to see if he could shine a little light on things and confirm or deny these numbers. He, in his infinite wisdom, as someone who has been covering the ins and outs of box office numbers and marketing for 23 years, according to him, was kind enough to respond, and his response was pretty much exactly what I expected. I asked him if he thinks these figures are accurate, and he responded, quote, "Not a chance. If the budget were $225 million, which it clearly is not, we'd be looking at around $200 million in marketing, giving a total cost of $425 million. Break-even point would actually be over $850 million minimum. And that's only if the budget is as low as the reported $225 million.
Show me the money.
So we're talking about a difference of about $350 million between one break-even point that's being reported and another one. Obviously, $500 million sounds a lot more attainable as a break-even point than $850 million does. The truth is, ladies and gentlemen, is that all signs point to this movie needing to be a mega hit in order for it to be considered a legitimate success. I'm talking Deadpool and Wolverine numbers, or at the very least, Multiverse of Madness numbers. And without the multiverse gimmick, without the benefit of nostalgia, without the benefit of a unified fan base, I do think that it's going to be difficult for Superman to attain those kind of numbers. What it's going to need is phenomenal word of mouth and general public interest that we rarely see in the comic book movie genre at this point. I do think that this is a lot to ask of this movie, no matter what way you look at it. You are asking audiences to place their faith in a character and a brand that isn't exactly a sure thing anymore. And I do believe there could potentially be a manipulation of the numbers when the time comes.
What is real? How do you define real?
Because if WB truly wants DC to be just like Marvel, manipulating the perception of your movie through social media is part of that process. To me, if I'm already asking questions as it pertains to the budget and how it's being presented to us, then that kind of tells me that certain provisions are being put into place as a way of protecting this movie. This is another reason why, again, I suggest that you do not believe everything you read on social media. You don't even have to believe me. I urge you just to think for yourself. At this point, who knows what to believe? And again, I'm not saying that this movie won't be successful. And a big reason for that is that all of the confusion and misinformation we typically see around box office numbers has now programmed me to be skeptical of any number that's being reported. But as I stated from the very beginning, I do believe, for better or for worse, James Gunn's Superman is fighting a bit of an uphill battle. We have a fractured fan base, an uncertain general public appeal, a historically incompetent studio, and a mediocre at best filmmaker who no longer has the benefit of operating under the MCU umbrella. That's a lot to overcome, especially if this movie needs to make the amount of money that we think it needs to make.
Y'all be cool. Right on.